welcome to the 64 Tacos Podcasts. This is episode 111, 64 Tacos Book Club, Out of the Silent Planet, Part 4.
Hello and welcome to another 64 Tacos podcast. Today we're going to finish up our book club series on the C.S. Lewis book, Out of the Silent Planet. Coming into this one, we have read through chapter 16, and we're going to talk about chapter 17 through 22 today. We've got 3 podcasts that we recorded before this, if you're interested in checking those out.
All right, so where we last left our protagonist, he was on the shoulders of Augre the Sorn, coming down from the peak, headed down towards Meldorn, right? In order to meet Oyarsa. That journey continues, and they arrive. He finds that all 3 types of Now, the Sorn, Cross, and Fifiltrig, are all present there. He is allowed to roam about a bit until the call comes out for him. I think he goes and sleeps, and then he sort of just hangs around, and then he actually meets Fifiltrig, who, as it turns out, is taking his portrait in stone. So that happens. He's not too impressed with his appearance, which may have more to do with his thoughts about the human race as much as whether or not it was inaccurate. He says it's not accurate, but the Fifiltrig says it was not intended to be. It was made to be more understandable by the people that see it later, which is kind of interesting. So then the call comes out for him to go meet Oyarsa, and he finds that there are thousands, perhaps if you count the Eldil, maybe even millions who are going to witness this. He walks up a street lined with many of the different creatures, the aliens, the Martians. He, while waiting for a long while, is then approached by Oyarsa himself, who is much like an Eldil, kind of a light being who almost can't be seen, but can definitely be seen. Oyarsa talks to him for a little while, asks him why he didn't come, why he was so afraid. Ransom answers the best that he can. And after they were discussing this for a while, Oyarsa is asking him questions about not only his own journey and his own feelings, but then he begins to ask him about what happened on Thulkandra, the silent planet, Earth. This is interrupted by the arrival of Weston and Divine. And here's another instance where Ransom is he sees them as the aliens they would be to the Malacandrians initially, kind of like how he didn't recognize or didn't appreciate the humanness of the picture of the Fifiltrig. And then he realizes that who he's looking at. After briefly seeing them as aliens, he then sees them as his fellow man. Weston and Divine come in and make generally great asses of themselves. They firmly believe that all the creatures are savages, uncivilized, uneducated, and so they treat them the way someone in the 30s might treat, Africans or Native Americans or Aboriginals or anybody who is not Western, essentially, who's living in the jungle or else outside of a city structure. Weston makes up a particular ass of himself to the point where at one point he decides that a sleepy Ross, an old man who's dozed off, must be the leader or the witch doctor, and he addresses all his shouting at this old creature who is just sleeping through all of it. At a certain point, Oyarsa says, "Go dunk his head in water." So he goes and he dunks his head in water. Has his head dunked in water. While he is gone, Oyarsa deals with the 3 Rasa that have been killed by Weston and Divine, the first being Hyoy, and the other 2, apparently when they captured them to bring them here to before Oyarsa, they killed 2 more. He does a thing, which is apparently, we learn later, is how all the people that die, essentially, mostly of natural causes, in Malacandra, they are brought to Oyarsa, and then he unbodies them, as he calls it. He just touches them, and they disappear. So he does that to the 3. There is a song sung by the Harasa, and then Weston comes back, There's a segment where Ransom interprets Weston's very flowery speech into his rudimentary Malacandrian, which is kind of funny to hear the contrast of what the dignity that Weston is trying to impart to these sort of well-worn ideas. When you sort of break them down and deconstruct them, it all sounds a bit silly, which is what we end up seeing. Oyarsa listens and then decides that he needs to speak more with Ransom. He'll decide what to do after that. So he speaks with Ransom privately. We do not get to find out what that discussion is about. After he speaks with Ransom and they meet, again, he says, basically, I'm sending you back. Whether you want to or not, you're out of here. I won't kill you because you are not mine under my purview, but you're not going to be here, which based on the location of the planets is a real problem. So the journey becomes very, very dangerous. Ransom is given the choice of taking the risk of maybe making it back to Earth, maybe not, or staying on Malacandra. He decides to go home with Weston and Divine. Some safeguards, such as Eldil guards, are going to go with him, and also he has the only weapon on the ship now. Weston charts a course that's very risky by cutting across, basically really close to the sun in order to meet Earth. And they are given 90 days. Oyarsa puts a time bomb on the ship where it's going to blow up if after 90 days, basically. So they go on the journey. It's a very difficult journey. They go very close to the sun, almost to the point where they can't stand it. Then they come around the other side. They're getting very close to Earth, and something strange happens where basically they miss their mark. They all give up. Ransom passes out. And then when he awakes, they're on Earth. There's rain beating down on the ship. Weston and Divine have abandoned him, fearing the time bomb, no doubt. So he hops off, wanders to the nearest village, and orders a pint of beer. Then we pop out to our actual narrator, who appears to be sort of in a meta fiction kind of way, C.S. Lewis himself. The idea being
oddly the most bizarre part of the book.
Yes, it was interesting. He pops out and so C.S. Lewis is describing. He says, "Hey, this is where the story ends as far as the actual story." But he basically, the idea is this really happened. They wrote a fictionalized a account, kind of cloaked in fiction, to get the story out there. And he's just sort of saying, hey, you read this as fiction. This really happened. I changed the names due to some research. I coming across a word quite similar to Oyarsa. In my research, I ran into the Dr. Ransom, as he decided to call him, and they decided to write this. And then I'm not sure if you guys got the postscript in your.
Yes, I did.
Yep. So then there's the postscript, which is an excerpt of a letter written by our Dr. Ransom to C.S. Lewis. That basically says so much more happened. So, he's basically arguing you missed some details. I guess you know best since you are the writer, but, why couldn't you have talked about this or that? And he describes in certain depth specific memories he has. And basically it's a little bit of a teaser because as it turns out, the story is not over. And before we even published the book, events occurred, which made the publishing of the book kind of irrelevant, which I would assume is a lead into the next two books in the series. And that is where our tale ends. So what did you guys think? Why don't you start, Dave?
Well, I liked it a lot. As we've said in the last 3 episodes, it's great storytelling and description and atmosphere creating by Lewis. I kind of wonder if Ransom needed to be in the story at all, though, really, other than it's the character we follow, because he didn't actually do anything when it comes down to it. I mean, not really.
Yeah, stuff happens to him.
Stuff happens to him.
He is our eyes. He's for us to see what occurs, but he doesn't. He has no great feats. Well, I guess he helps kill the Hanakra, but that was going to probably happen anyway with or without him.
But other than that little complaint, and then the weirdness at the in the last chapter where Lewis, as you said, reveals himself as telling it's not a fiction story, but blah blah blah. Those were my only complaints. What did you think, Matt?
I liked the meta end. I really did like that. I thought that was fun. and like, oh, this is really real, but blah blah blah. And I love the little thing in the appendices or the postscript about, oh, you left out the part where the shutter was damaged when we landed, and
Yeah.
and everybody would understand why we couldn't close it if they knew it was damaged when we landed.
Listen, if Dr. Ransom just assumed that all the readers would be like you, who would be annoyed by the missing details, like, hey, that doesn't make any sense. Why didn't they just close the damn shutters?
It's true. Yeah, Ransom thought he was going to go blind several times in the story too. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
I also really liked the different way of thinking that the alien race had versus the human race, and how foreign human thought seemed to them. That was really fun to explore, and kind of the point of this whole book, it feels like.
Yeah, it was neat that the aliens weren't the villains in the story. It was the humans who caused the strife. So I thought that was a neat twist, and I'm sure certainly in the 1930s, that was not a familiar take on the interaction between humans and extraterrestrials.
Right. Zach, what were your thoughts?
I was kind of hoping that Devine and Weston would have gotten a little bit more just desserts than just like a dunking and then
waterboarding's not enough for you.
No, that's not enough. And then banished back to their home planet.
But Zach, his hat came off mid waterboard, and they had to do it again.
Yes, was that his hat or his toupee? Because it seemed like almost like his.
I think you're right. I think it was his toupee. Now that you mentioned it,
it felt like better. It was like they were talking about his toupee.
The animal over there.
But I did really like that whole sort of interrogation or trial, if you will, part where Oyarsa is talking to Weston and it was great how Weston was talking in this really low, almost caveman register, like me Weston, me don't like the I really enjoyed that, and then and Ransom is trying to translate at one point, and Weston's ginormous speech, and he can't, there are parts that he's like, I can't do this.
This was written in the sort of the early years, just before the war got going, World War II. But there's a little bit of I think possibly a little bit of Hitler and the Nazi ideals in Weston's speech about the sanctity of man and how our races must go on and it's most important, and life demands its extension and all these other things. I wonder if that was a bit of a shot at the burgeoning danger next door.
Yeah,
I'm
sure it was, because he very much speaks with that eugenics ideals.
And so Devine, I think, was the one who was basically only there for the gold. He really only cared about the precious metals, right? And yep. Weston was the one that was more about the spreading the humanity's oaths all over
the seed of humanity.
Yeah. And while I despised both characters, I could kind of understand Weston's plight a little bit more, that he wants to keep his race going, but his means of trying to do that, like you guys are saying, are inappropriate. And the fact that that both of them just go and kill anyone that they feel like is pretty ridiculous.
Well, that brings up an interesting wrinkle where Oyarsa says, did you ask yourself why the Malacandrians didn't come to your world? Our world is older than yours. And he points out that at one point they were capable of that. And in fact, he basically says that the bent Oyarsa, the bad Oyarsa of our world, who's been in prison since before we existed, came. I think the big mark on the moon. He implies that was he dented the moon with one hand, and with the other hand he destroyed the race of bird people that lived on the surface of Malacandra before. They basically, and then at the end of that thing, we sort of find out that they must have had great technology, for it looks like as you pull away all the valleys were built below the surface and appear to have been built by hand. Basically, they had to go inside the planet to survive, and they did that. All under the sort of context of it's an old civilization that's well past its peak. It's sort of in its twilight, and yet it exists still, and there's a lot of peace. So while we say, oh, we're like Weston would say, oh, we are the superior civilized, race, the Malacandrian or Oyarsa might say, well, we got past all that BS, that teenage crap that you guys are currently in the middle of on your planet. We're into our sort of peaceful retirement, waiting for the end, which will come at some point. But we're not afraid. We're just that's okay. That was an interesting idea to think of. They weren't uncivilized. They were post civilization. They were beyond that point to the sort of point where they weren't squabbling over money or power or land or anything like that, or racial, racial wars or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and given that this is C.S. Lewis, and while it's not overtly expressed, you could almost make the connection that like Malacandra was almost sort of like a heaven place, and with like Oyarsa, essentially the god, and that the bent world of Thulkandra is more of the sinful place, the place that's been touched by Satan, or whatever the Judeo-Christian way would believe that.
Well,
and I actually appreciate that about his writing, because I don't, while I can recognize that those themes are there, it wasn't like try to be forced down my throat in any way.
A little subtler than Lion Witch in the Wardrobe.
Yeah.
No literal crucifixions,
Yeah.
You were going to say, Dave?
I was going to say that they literally call, rather than referring to what we say is outer space, they call it the heavens. And early on, Ransom thinks, an older generation of humans, long time ago, used to think of as space as the heavens, and now that he's there, he can see that and he feels that. And then when he gets to talking with Oyarsa, he literally calls it the heavens, and then the planets are within the heavens, and they're where the heavens aren't, basically. So, and then he says I don't know, I don't remember if the character is named, but the Earth's Oyarsa basically had the Satan or the Lucifer story where he fell from grace.
Yeah.
And the planet went dark or silent after that. Yep. And he corrupted his Haras, or not Haras. Now, yeah.
Yeah, or almost he corrupted the bed in which they grew, because it seemed to happen before they were born. But then our planet grew up without the sort of in the wrong environment, and therefore we grew up bent for the most part. And that was one of the interesting things. You mentioned that the humans were the bad guys. Humanity was bad. And the way he accomplished that was simply by having a group of people who were ignorant of the way that we do things undermine our assumptions about the right way that things should work, by just asking what seemingly childlike questions about what is there not enough food for everyone? Why would we? Right. Why would he's talking to the Fifil Trig, and he says, was everybody happy to be in the mines? And he's like, oh, yeah, I mean, everyone does their part, and, it's fine, and there's no problem. And he says, what about in your plan? He says, well, we have miners, but I don't know if they love it, because the way he has to phrase it in his rudimentary language skills and to make them understand is, if they stop, we won't give them food, which is kind of a brutal takedown of capitalism.
And that's the beautiful thing about him creating this other vernacular, is it forces you to look at the core ideas of what we as a society value versus what the core values of the Malacandrians value. You know?
Yeah, it's the contrast that makes it plain who the bad guys are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention in my theory that, well, not my theory, but the theory that Dr. Ransom, number one, his name is kind of funny when you think of it as a pseudonym because he was kidnapped. So Ransom is fitting. But also the theory that Ransom is Tolkien.
Yes.
Particularly convincing is the fact that during his basically his editorial reply to a manuscript in the postscript, Dr. Ransom is like, I mean, you're telling me these people aren't interested in the language, but man, you really cut a bunch of that language stuff out. Something which Tolkien probably had the same conversation with many of the people when he was publishing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So he says, "Screw you guys, I'm gonna just, I'm going to write about the languages because I think the languages are interesting." But Lewis cuts a bunch of that stuff out.
So, Matt, overall, how would you rate this book?
How many tacos are we giving it?
Out of 64.
If that's the scale you want to use.
4 out of 10 or on a grading scale, whatever you want.
Like for me, I'm going to say read it.
Okay. I'd say it's a 9 out of 10. There's a lot of really good stuff there.
How about you, Zach?
I would give it an enthusiastic thumbs up.
All right, and Dan.
Yeah, I'll give it. I'll give it. I'll give it an 8.5 on the Matt scale. It doesn't have. There's not as much action as there could be, but the fact that the book is really fascinating despite that, I think is a testament to the writing and the ideas.
Okay, well, there you have it. I think that's going to conclude our series on the C.S. Lewis book Out of the Silent Planet. We may continue in the this is a trilogy, and there's a chance we'll continue with it. We might do another book for our next book club. We may never read again. I don't know, but this will be where you would find it, wherever you're listening to this podcast. So tune in then.
I caught it on audio.